Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. So last week I went to go watch The Voice of Hind Rajab, directed by Tunisian filmmaker Kaouthar Ben Hania, a harrowing and poignant docufictional drama based on the real-life story of a 6-year-old Palestinian child whose family have been shot to death by IDF soldiers completely unprovoked. The narrative focuses on the operators at the Palestinian Red Crescent Society who received the call from a terrified Hind, and over the course of several hours attempt the rescue, navigating complex and inane geopolitical treaties and regulations, but to no avail. Hind dies several hours later after being shot at 335 times over the course of the day. My intention with this video will be less of a review and more of a discussion, so if you've come to this video to be told whether to watch the video or not, I will save you the time and tell you to go ahead and watch it anyway, because it was brilliant. I believe that anyone who has ever had a smidge of doubt as to whether what is going on in Palestine and Gaza is ever real should watch the film. If you're someone who thinks that the tears and screams seen on social media from parents cowering over the blown limbs of their children is exaggerated or performative or fake, you should go and watch the film. If you think that Gen Z marching the streets with their kafirs chanting from the river to the sea is performative or disruptive or offensive, you should go watch the film. And on the other hand, if you do believe what you see happening in Palestine, if you spend your weekends marching the streets for the freedom of the Palestinian people, if you spend your time campaigning for their freedom, watch the film anyway, because the genocide and eviction of Palestinians from their land is something that should remain in the broad cultural conversation forever. That being said, I will be tackling my criticism of the film like any other. The sharing of stories on a large cinematic scale means that works of art that portray suffering will always be tied with the consequence of voyeurism, especially if that story is based on real-life stories of tragedy and suffering. In Ethics and Voyeurism, Alessandro Pasquino attempts to moralize the issue of voyeurism by insinuating that some kind of call to action would stop a passive viewer from turning into a voyeur. This idea asks us to consider the aims of the docufictional genre and what it hopes to achieve. There are two primary aims of the genre: remembrance and action. Remembrance implies that a film is created to bring awareness to a particular period of history through a fictionalized narrative lens. An example of this would be Holocaust cinema, a sect of cinema whose aim is to ensure that both the atrocities and acts of heroism of the Second World War are remembered and remain in the cultural consciousness forever. The second aim, action, implies that a film is created to raise awareness of current, ongoing affairs. In the case of The Voice of Hind Rajab, director Kaouthar Ben Hania was spurred to write and direct this film not only to bring awareness to Hind Rajab's story, but to bring about action and change, to inspire whomever watches the film, lawmakers, prime ministers, students, to parents, to children, to help end the genocide in Gaza. Here, the message is simple: act now. From a technical and temporal point of view then, remembrance has the advantage of time that action does not. Remembrance films depicting traumatic periods in history, such as the Holocaust, are allowed to be more visually considered, creative and stunning. This is because there is no urgency to get the film out. World War II is over, the camps were liberated 81 years ago, Hitler is dead, and we all collectively agree that what happened to the Jews was horrific and should never happen again. Therefore, Holocaust period filmmakers have the luxury of time to spend thinking about visual storytelling and craft. Schindler's List famously took over a decade to make in its entirety. This is because, despite being given the story 10 years prior to filming, Spielberg wanted to wait until he felt mature as a filmmaker to tackle such a sensitive and complex story. On the flip side, films depicting current ongoing tragedies, with the aim to bring about immediate action or change, don't always have the same luxury of time to think about aesthetics or cinematography or clever motifs or the most creative shots. The Voice of Hind Rajab was filmed in 3 weeks compared to Spielberg's 10 years. Since the story of Hind Rajab had to be told urgently and immediately, the film is by no means the most cinematic or visually impressive. In fact, the film's glossy and generic visuals are what struck me the most when I first saw the trailer. The visuals are quite Hollywoodized, as Peter Bradshaw writes in The Guardian, and lack the grit expected from a war film. Perhaps Ben Hania opted for a melodramatic, Hollywoodized work of fiction because she knew that the only way to get a desensitized Western audience to accept the film was to offer up a glossed-up version of tragedy. Either way, Ben Hania's decision to fictionalize the story provides an interesting close reading for anyone interested in how we consume real-life tragedy in the modern world, specifically with how it has to be costumed, manipulated, sensationalized, and thus palatable for a 21st century audience. However, what the movie lacks in visuals, it makes up for in its audio, which layers the real-life call log on top of the actor's dialogue, to recreate the conversation that Hind would have had with the call center operators. The film is not a war film in the traditional sense. It is not set on a battlefield. We don't see blood or shrapnel flying through the air. The film isn't shot in the car with Hind as she experiences the brutality of war. Rather, the film is set in a busy and clinical-looking office space, thus subverting our expectations of what a conflict film should look like. Sure, Ben Hania could have chosen to focus the story on Hind Rajab's final hours in the car. However, the distance allows for the audience to take more of an active role in filling in the blanks for themselves. What Hind experiences in the several hours it takes for the operators at the Red Center to coordinate the rescue are all left to our imagination. How we choose to imagine the 6-year-old begging to be rescued is up to us. Whether she lays low in the car, occasionally peeking through the shattered windows to see the same faceless tank that hours before killed her family staring back at her, is up to us. Does she eventually realize that she's surrounded by corpses, or does her brain's defense mechanisms trick her into believing that they're still just sleeping? What does the phone she's calling from look like? Does it have a phone case? What's the image on the lock screen? All of these details are left for the audience to consider. This is what distance does. Let's talk a little bit about the film's reception. Some critics were not a fan of Ben Hania's inclusion of the phone calls, referring to it as exploitative and gimmicky. Peter Bradshaw claims that the film was exploitative in presenting the authentic shattering recordings in a Hollywoodized suspense drama, getting actors to cry and rage alongside a kind of docufictional hologram, almost instructing the audience in how they too should be responding. I agree with Bradshaw's point to an extent. I agree to an extent that the actors instruct our reaction to Hind's calls, but that's mainly because we're taking in the story from their point of view. In an interview with British Vogue, director Ben Hania claims that the actors purposely rehearse the scenes without using the audio, to ensure an authentic reaction. As a result, the purity of Omar and Rana's reactions confirm and validate our own. I did find that my own feelings of anger and frustration and helplessness intensified when the characters' own feelings of those emotions intensified. I did feel at times that I was reacting to Omar and Rana's suffering more than Hind's, but this is because we see their suffering rather than just hear it. We see them holding back tears only to let them go in between calls. We see their faces scrunch up in anger, and we see their bodies respond in frustration when what is quite a simple rescue mission gets compromised due to inane geopolitical treaties, hunched in moments of helplessness, or explode when angry. Therefore, I do agree with Bradshaw that the actors instruct, inform, and conduct our reactions to an extent. However, this does also then raise the concern as to why our emotions need instructing to what should be quite an obvious and clear-cut response to a black and white situation. Are we that desensitized and emotionally inept as a generation? My experience of seeing this film at the theatres says not. Throughout the film, I could hear sobbing, sniffling, and the sound of bodies readjusting themselves to cope with the discomfort of what was being presented. When the film ended, there was a stunned silence all around as no one moved to get up. Whether this was because people were still digesting what they had seen, or because they didn't want to be seen crying as they walked down the aisle, or because they were too stunned to even move, I'm not sure, but I have never experienced collective tension like this before. Usually everyone seems to rush to leave when the film is over, and certainly don't wait around for the credits to finish rolling. Therefore, what I am sure of is that clearly everyone had been affected by the film, and it's a story they will take with them into their lives, a story they will mention in their discussions and consider in their politics. It's definitely not a film they will leave by their seats along their empty popcorn boxes and stale drinks. A scene I found interesting was a blink and you'll miss it. It takes place during the end of the film during the climax. It follows a big blowout between Omar and Mahdi, who have differing views on how to navigate the rescue mission. Mahdi locks himself in the loose and Omar follows after. Both men leave their frustrations towards each other to the side and battle each other in a video game. The point of this scene is to show that, though Omar doesn't agree with Mahdi's decision to do things by the book, even at the cost of time, he knows that it can't be helped and that Mahdi is not to blame. He is simply at the mercy of inhumane and absurd geopolitical restrictions created by the IDF to justify their occupation and violence. What particularly interested me about the scene was the fact that both men retreat to a violent video game as a way to temporarily disassociate from the real-life violence that surrounds them on a daily basis. I think it speaks to how desensitized those at the center of violence can become to manufactured violence. Maybe it even minimizes the concerns that many parents and teachers, especially in the West, have regarding the harmful consequences of violence in video games, because nothing lives up to the long-term mental effects that real-life violence has upon you. It makes a mockery out of those who spend more energy and time to ban artificial violence, yet turn their eyes to the real thing. A critique of soccer mom politics. Bradshaw makes an interesting point when he says that the film would have worked better as a documentary. He says, "It might have been just as moving to present this extraordinary real-life recording in the straightforward documentary context of interviews with the responders and emergency workers. This might have made clearer what happened from their point of view, why they were impeded from helping Rajab, and what continues to hinder them." For the record, I disagree with Bradshaw here. I think that the docufictional form does put across why responders were impeded from helping Rajab. It's pretty straightforward to me. But it is interesting to consider how form and genre affect audience expectations. Firstly, I think a documentary would have helped with the claims that the use of Hind's voice was exploitative or in poor taste. This is because the documentary form is synonymous with truth and credibility and would have been the perfect platform to put across a real piece of evidence. Secondly, from a completely strategic point of view, The Voice of Hind Rajab would be a shoo-in for an Oscar if it was in the documentary category. At the moment it's nominated in the category for Best International Feature, and though it has a strong chance, it is up against Sentimental Value, which is another strong contender. I personally believe that either one will end up winning. The movie does contain real-life footage and interviews usually found in documentaries. These scenes appear at the end in the form of videos of Hind at home and at the beach, interviews with her mum, as well as coverage of the wreck. I think these scenes at the end are necessary, not only as they really hone home the reality of the situation, but they also allow us to see what Hind would have seen, as we're shown the bullet-wrecked car that Hind hid in for several hours before her death. An interview with Hind's mother also puts forward the aftermath of the situation as well as the long-lasting implications of what was an act of unprecedented, irrational and rash act of violence. These scenes force our imagination to contend with the reality, because so far we have had to imagine Hind's side of the narrative. We've had to imagine what she was experiencing in the final hours, as the story is told from the operator's point of view. And what the footage at the end proves is that the reality of the situation is always worse than what we imagine. We imagine the 335 bullets to the car to be justified somehow, because, after all, the IDF is a military organization that's been around for nearly a century. They must know what they're doing. Their every act of destruction, no matter how extreme, has to be justified surely. That's how we try to make sense of it in our mind. But when we actually see the footage of the wrecked car, we see that they're in fact not strategic or justified or rational, but gluttonous, random, irrational, and inhumane. To conclude today's video, I want to end with something actor Jessie Buckley said about the film when she introduced it at a screening. She says,
"I don't know how to be human. I need stories like this to wake me up."
I believe she speaks to the cultural desensitized nature that has become the cultural zeitgeist of the moment, and how stories like Hind's are the antidote to help us address our insensitivities, callousness, and political disinterests, naiveties, and ignorances. Thanks for watching. Let me know down below what you thought of the film. And don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. Bye!